Welcome to Stories in the Inglenook. Thank you for visiting. Today, we will be telling a story titled The Faerie Folk of Roisin. This is an original story written by D.M. Ravshanov in an unpublished manuscript. So grab a pillow, a blanket, and your favorite beverage of choice, and gather round the fireside in the Inglenook as we prepare to be transported into another world. Once upon a time, in a little sleepy village by the name of Roisin, long before the days of domestic pets, animals of all kinds roamed the village freely in the wee hours of the night. For fear of the cruel hunters that lived in the village, the animals hid in the vast forest surrounding the village during daylight. They ate the wild blackberries that grew in the forest for nourishment, drank pure golden honey from the royal hives of their bee friends, and sipped from the cool, clear streams of water that wound their way through the heart of the forest. When the villagers of Roisin blew out the candles in their windows and fell fast asleep, the forest would come to life with the music of birds, the twinkling lights of millions of fireflies, and the whistles, grumbles, howls, and guffaws of all of the colorful animals, now wide awake and feeling perfectly safe to go about their business. The moon would shine her friendly light down from the elements above to light the way for the animals leaving the forest for their late-night adventures. Cats, dogs, tigers, snakes, bears, lizards, birds, and marvelous animals, some of which don't even exist anymore today, happily trailed off to the village to bask in their starlit freedom without the fear of being hunted. Once in the village, with the humans fast asleep in their trundle beds, the dusty roads would come to life. Flocks of birds danced in the sky, creating a flowing tapestry of wings and stars in the night. Bears stood jollily upon their hind legs, and holding one another's paws, would dance jovially in a circle, kicking up dust as they went. The tigers and panthers and cats of the forest of all shapes and sizes held roof-jumping contests to see who could jump over the hay-thatched houses first. The snakes practiced their handwriting in the dusty roads, creating shapes resembling letters in the dirt and sand with their slithering bodies. Other animals, all different shapes and sizes, spotted, striped, scaled, furry, and slimy, would peek through the windows of the hay-thatched houses of the village to see if they could spot a sleeping human out of curiosity, or if they could perhaps spot a pie or seed-bearing plant in the window that they could swipe and take with them back to the forest before morning. Yes, the world of Roisin was a cacophony of curious, bustling creatures at this time of night. When the first rays of the sun peeked her sleepy head above the trees of the forest surrounding Roisin, the animals would scramble back into the safety of the tangled forest to hide their day away once again. One morning, after a particularly festive evening amongst the animals in the village, a hunter by the name of Sir Blackheart stumbled upon some curious form of writing in the dirt upon the road outside of his tiny picturesque home in the village. He rubbed his eyes with his fist, shook his head, and looked again. What he read was the following: "I was here? I said the puzzled hunter out loud. "Who is I?" He went through all of the names of the villagers he knew in his head. Ingrid Wellington, the seamstress, there's Iqbal the butcher, Isla the village healer, Isaac, Ida, I. None of these names seemed to help him form any sort of conclusion as to who would have written such curious words outside of his home. Nevertheless, he decided to ask around. And so, that day, he visited the villagers with names that began with I, one by one, and one by one each of them very convincingly, I might add, denied writing anything at all of the sort in the dirt outside of his house. Sir Blackheart was convinced that this was the work of an outsider. Being the most famed hunter of Roisin and a trusted protector of the village, he decided that he would be completely useless if he couldn't come to some sort of conclusion as to who the culprit was. And so it was he decided to catch them. That night, just before the sun closed her sleepy eyes and slipped beneath the top of the forest, Sir Blackheart set a trap. He placed a fresh-baked pie in the middle of the road on the outskirts of his little home, blew out the candle in his window, and hurried into the shadowy corners of his room to see if he might catch a glimpse of this mysterious eye. First, he heard a whistle, and then a guffaw, as small twinkling lights crept their way into his window, creating a ripple effect on the wall above his trundle bed. "What in heaven's name?" he whispered into the still dark night of his room, and then, careful not to be seen, he slowly and carefully peeked outside the side of his window. Sir Blackheart's blood went cold at the sight. Creatures of all shapes, sizes, and colors had infiltrated the village. Some had fangs and large claws and were dancing. He squinted his eyes curiously and could just make out a troop of wolves feasting upon the pie he had set in the middle of the road, while birds sang to them above and snakes slithered and tumbled over each other in the dirt. The snakes! He peered closely as he noticed a particularly quick snake that seemed to be doing a dance of some sort in the dirt outside of his home. He was leaving markings in the dirt in the wake of the moonlight, and they seemed to be legible letters of some sort. How could this be? Suddenly, he knew who the culprit was, but it was impossible. Snakes couldn't spell. But there it was in plain moonlight, and suddenly Sir Blackheart was trembling. These animals had no right to infiltrate his village, while he and his fellow villagers were fast asleep in their beds, waiting to get up in the wee hours of the morning so they could hunt for food to put upon their tables. He knew what he had to do. Carefully and quietly, he reached for his rifle leaning against his bedstand. Sir Blackheart rushed out of his tiny hay-thatched home, and the animals stopped dead at the sight of him. The world suddenly became a chorus of shrieks and growls and frightened, scurrying animals as the pale and trembling beard-faced villager raised his rifle and shot the animals one by one until they lay cold in the settling dust of the roads. The moon glared at him, and the stars turned out their lights as the hunter fainted from shock. The next morning, a weary and confused Sir Blackheart awoke in his trundle bed. Suddenly, everything came back to him in a flash, and he rushed to his window and threw open the shutters. As he peered out onto the roads of the village, his jaw dropped. The bodies of the animals he had shot the night before were nowhere to be found. Could it have been a dream? He looked down at his trembling hands and noticed he was still wearing his day garments and his rifle was lying on the bed. He examined it and immediately observed that it was no longer loaded. No, it was not a dream. He had killed a forest full of animals last night, and the last thing he remembered was the moon baring her teeth at him. And then he had awoken to this. Sir Blackheart didn't know what had happened to the animals, but he decided to push it from his mind, wash up, and carry on with his day. Besides, they deserved it, didn't they? He justified to himself. If an animal was going to enter into his village, it should only be upon his plate. Why else did the men of Roisin work so hard to bring food home to their families? It was his duty, after all, as the most famed hunter of Roisin and the trusted protector of the village. The day slipped by quickly, and before he knew it, it was time to climb into bed. That night, Sir Blackheart awoke to the most beautiful music he had ever heard, coming from outside. It sounded like a wedding celebration. Who would be celebrating at this time of night, he thought. He climbed out of bed and tiptoed to his window. But when he peered outside, there was nothing out of the ordinary, and so he shrugged his shoulders and went back to bed. This continued the next night, and the next, for some time, until Sir Blackheart began to question whether or not he was losing his mind. Other villagers began to notice his decline, and could often observe him muttering to himself about snakes that could spell, dancing bears, and music in the night. Eventually, all of the villagers came together and decided that for his safety and for their own, they should commit him to the village asylum, which was really just an abandoned mill on the outskirts of the village where they quarantined their sick and dying, and which the village healer often frequented to help take care of them. And so it was that Sir Blackheart was taken away to the village asylum, and life went back to normal in the sleepy village of Roisin. That is, except for the animals that visited once again in the wee hours of the night. Only this time, they all had wings and could soar high above the village. They danced among the stars, the moon smiling once again, making the most beautiful music ever to be heard amongst mankind. There are only 2 people in the world that have heard this music. The ruthless Sir Blackheart, who came to a terrible end, dwindling away in the old mill at the end of the village, and one small girl who would awaken every night and tiptoe out the gate of the garden outside of her hay-thatched hut to hear the music. And eventually she learned all of the words to the song. This is what they sang. We the 4-leggeds in the hush of the trees, eating berries and honey with our friends the bees. We used to crawl, slither and run, but then we were slain and now shine with the sun. The hunter, he saw us and we gave him a fright, so he raised his cold rifle in the dead of the night. But not to fear, though these are terrible things, for now we are free and we all have wings. Every morning at the breakfast table, the small girl would hum the song as she ate her porridge. One day, after many months had passed, her old mother asked her what song she was humming. "Why, don't you know, Mother? It's the song of the fairy animals of Roisin," she replied. The end. This concludes our story for the hour. Thank you for visiting Stories in the Inglenook. Stay tuned for more stories every day.